Up and down the country, there are remnants of medieval settlements that have been gradually lost to time. Wharram Percy in Yorkshire is one such village. It was largely abandoned after the last villagers were forcibly exiled from their homes in the 16th century, and the buildings were either torn down or left to decay, but not without leaving behind a dark secret, one that wasn't uncovered until centuries later, and one that we still don't fully understand to this day. So Wharram Percy sits in the Yorkshire Wolds, about 20-ish miles northeast of the city of York. And while we don't know exactly when it was properly established as a village, it's thought that there was some sort of settlement here established in 50 BC, but that one was abandoned again in the 5th century. They must have tried again at some sort of settlement, whether an actual village or just a temporary spot to rest in the 7th century, as artefacts have been found from that time period, but it wasn't until somewhere between the years 850 and 950 that's when they decided to make a real go of it here. Parish and field boundaries were drawn out, and they whipped up a church made out of wood. And so that was that. You got a church, you got a village. And it was this farming community, growing crops, tending livestock, living off the land and making the landowners money, who at the time were 3 men called Logman, Carly and Kjetilbjørn. The little community continued to thrive, and at some point they rebuilt their church in stone. But as with most stories I cover that go this far back in time, we then get to William the Conqueror and the Norman conquest. After he defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings and worked his way up the rest of the country to bring everything under Norman control, the village was recorded in the Domesday Book in 1086 called Wharram, possibly being the Old Norse word for bend, as it sits in the bend of a valley. Makes sense. But the Normans weren't just going to stop at writing down its name in a big old book. The lands that made up the village of Wharram were confiscated from the 3 men and distributed to William's own mates, including Osbert the Sheriff and the Norman Baron William de Percy. For us mere commoners at Wharram, it was basically a case of put up and shut up, you've got new landlords whether you want it or not. The village itself was set out into tofts and crofts, which is super fun to say, but the toft was the land on which your house would be built, maybe some outbuildings too, and then the croft was a narrow strip of land that you would work, growing crops or tending to livestock. There was also fish ponds, water mills and a manor house too, so it was this proper little settlement. By 1254 all of the lands had come under the ownership of the Percy family, and so it's thought that at that point Wharram became known as Wharram Percy. The village continued to grow, more rows of houses were built, a new manor was built too, and it's thought that at this point in the 13th century there were about 200 people living there. But the Percys continued to make more improvements to the area too. By the 1320s there was even a hunting park mentioned in the records. Not for the riffraff, obviously, don't even think about it or you'd pay. But the early 14th century was, unbeknownst to the Percy family and the rest of the inhabitants of Wharram Percy, the beginning of the end for the village, quite violently. In 1315, the lord of the manor at the time, a Peter Percy, he had died young, without a male heir. He did, however, have a daughter, Eustacia. Problem was, she was around 2 years old at the time that her dad died. Because of the way things worked in England, no male heir meant that Eustacia became a ward of the crown. Which sounds fancy, but basically that meant that control of all of the lands was handed over to the king's people, who would, of course, pocket any profit out of it. Until obviously Eustacia was old enough to take back the reins herself, once she was suitably married off, of course. But the crown taking the money and making the eldest daughter a ward, bringing her under royal guardianship, is absolutely not the same as protecting and managing the day-to-day and bigger picture life of the village, the very thing it needed to continue to prosper and grow, like it had been under the control of the Percy family. But instead it meant that for 12 years, until Eustacia was of age to marry, Wharram Percy didn't really have a lord of the manor. No one who really cared what happened to the place beyond what they could squeeze out of the farmers who lived there. And it was truly the worst possible moment for the lights to go out, because trouble was on its way. In 1319, 4 years after Peter had died, the Scots, as part of the Wars of Scottish Independence, had started coming down across the border and raiding villages in the north of England. They tore through the region, burning 7 farmsteads in the nearby village of Thixondale, just absolutely laying waste to the area. The villagers of Wharram Percy, knowing that there was no one really to protect them, started to pack up and scatter. The population, after sitting around 200 during its heyday, dropped to something closer to 70. By 1323, 2/3 of the village's farmland was fallow, just completely left back to nature, and the watermills, sat idle. It wasn't until 1327, when Eustacia turned 14, that the crown's grip on the village was finally able to be loosened somewhat. She was married off to a guy called Walter Heselton from a village a few miles north, and they had a son together who was also called Walter. It looked for a time, though, that this might be it. The village was back under local control and management, until the Black Death paid a visit in 1349. Eustacia's husband, Walter Sr., he was actually taken by the plague, as well as around 20-ish other villagers. Little Walter Jr. was still too young to inherit everything when his dad died, and so yet again, the crown swooped in. This time, officials claimed that Eustacia herself was mentally incapable of running the show. So of course, they were the only ones left to take control while Walter was growing up. It gets sadder though. Walter Jr. died childless in 1366, and with no one left in his line to inherit, Wharram Percy passed over to a distant but much more powerful Percy relative, a man called Henry. And this guy, he had a castle in Spofforth. He wasn't about to move into a little village in the valley. And so by 1368, the manor was crumbling and completely worthless. The village itself had done what it could to rebuild after the plague. 30 houses were occupied by farmers, all of that uncultivated soil was growing crops again, and even the mills and ponds were turning a profit. Around 1400, the Percy family handed over Wharram in exchange for a manor owned by a baron called William Hilton. The Hiltons, while of course, again, they were probably much too great and powerful to move to the village, they did leave their mark on the place, carving the family's coat of arms into the church tower. But under the Hiltons, things in the village got worse. Because it was around this time that the prices for wool were climbing all across England. Obviously, it was used to produce wool cloth, which was getting more and more profitable for the country to export. A lot of landowners had realised that sheep farming was where the money was at, rather than growing crops. But also, you need a lot fewer people to manage a flock of sheep than you do to work a field. And so bit by bit, Wharram Percy's farmland got turned over into pasture, and that population, which had clawed its way back, started shrinking. By the mid-1430s, the village was down to around 16 households, and falling rapidly. There was a sharp drop in Wharram Percy's population in 1458, thought to be because of evictions, although we don't know for sure. But it is pretty suspicious when it was recorded in 1500 that another 4 families were evicted forcibly, and their homes destroyed to make way for more sheep grazing. In 1527, the last families were turfed out, and the last arable strips of land were converted to pasture. After that, just a few smallholders and shepherds called the village home, but it was hardly the community that it had been before. The last farmstead was torn down around 1636, and that was it. The dilapidated manor and the lands that Wharram Percy had stood on continued to change hands through the centuries, eventually landing with a family who still own it today. New buildings did also go up on the old site. There was a farmhouse in the late 1700s and labourers' cottages in the 1800s, and so here and there, a couple of people were still living and working the farmland that made up the medieval village. The last burial in the graveyard was 1906, and the last couple to get married in the church was in 1928, with the last service being held in 1949, until all the furniture was removed in 1954, and the bell tower actually collapsed in 1959, and they just didn't bother rebuilding it. The last cottages, though, weren't actually completely emptied out until 1976, which kind of really puts all of this into perspective. You say abandoned medieval village, which is kind of what it's known as, and you just picture the rubble and the earthworks. But in reality, 1976, that's Clint Eastwood, Jackie Chan and Burt Reynolds in the cinemas. That's disco music playing in nightclubs. Really, it's somebody's nan doing her weekly shop and coming home to a cottage sat on top of a village that had already been officially deserted for 400 years. But many more who lived and worked at Wharram Percy over the centuries aren't here to tell you about it, but they are still there in the village, along with the foundations of the homes that they lived in and the remnants of the church that they prayed in. And starting in the mid-20th century, that's exactly what archaeologists set out to dig back up. In June 1948, an economic historian called Maurice Beresford came to take a look, something that I had no idea existed, but I guess it makes sense. He looked into the history of economics and how economics varied during points in history. Anyway, he liked what he saw enough to come back properly properly in 1950, and a couple of years later was joined by a colleague called John Hurst. And what followed was 40 years of digging at the site. Every single summer from 1950 right through to 1990, archaeologists worked through the village. They excavated 687 skeletons from the churchyard, which were all analysed and really painted a picture about what life was like living in Wharram Percy during the medieval period. One of the things that they found with the stone church itself was the different iterations of it through the years as it grew and shrank with the village. But really interestingly, there were also bits of timber there, which sounds like a minor detail, but that proves that this exact patch of ground was the religious heart of the village the entire time that it was occupied. And that is a very important detail for what they later found outside of the consecrated ground. Because between 1963 and 1964, while they were excavating house foundations, they uncovered a mishmash group of bones in 3 overlapping pits between the houses, nowhere near the churchyard. Initially, very easy to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe they'd stumbled on a burial pit from an even earlier time, possibly even Roman. I mean, there was a Roman villa just down the road. And weirdly, there was Roman pottery found inside the pit too. However, carbon dating was done in the 1980s that disproved that, and found that the bones were medieval, but that was about the extent of the analysis at that point. Until in 2017, a team led by Simon Mays, a skeletal biologist working for Historic England, and Professor Alistair Pike from the University of Southampton actually sat down and looked at what they'd found in that pit. There had been 137 bones recovered, belonging to at minimum 10 people. There were at least 2 adult women, 2 adult men, a teenager aged between 15 and 17, and between 2 and 3 very young children aged between 2 and 4. They narrowed down that the bones had been dated to between the 11th and 13th centuries too, so within the time that Wharram Percy was a thriving farming village. But the part that gets really dark was the state that the bones were found in. Some had been hacked away at, other bones had knife marks, skulls had been removed and thrown in a fire, there were little char marks on vertebrae. Some of the bones had even been snapped and twisted too. All of these injuries happened after death, which, I don't know about you, but that's not how you bury your loved ones. So what had happened here in this little community to cause villagers to do this to the remains of people? And not only that, but like I said, between the 11th and 13th centuries, that's hundreds of years between the earliest and the latest that this practice had been going on. And so that means that whatever it was, that's a generational thing, surely. Whatever they were doing was passed down from parent to child for centuries. So there were some theories put forward as to just what was going on here. Possibly this group of people weren't part of the community. If they were outsiders, they might have been treated with suspicion, made outcasts even after death. However, that theory was put to bed when strontium isotope analysis was done on the teeth of the remains. And what that means is it's basically a test that can tell you where the person grew up. That analysis came back, suggesting that they were all from the local area, possibly even right there in the village. So outcast doesn't seem to fit. Could they have been criminals, executed, anything like that? Again, maybe. But it seems pretty harsh to do that to a 2-year-old, right? Okay, so could it have been cannibalism? This area was hit by famine. If you had a failed crop one year, you were in trouble. Because the long bones found in the pit had obviously been deliberately broken, and the logical explanation for that would be possibly desperate people trying to get to the marrow inside. And there isn't much outright evidence to say that that definitely wasn't the case 100%, but it's weird that most of the cut marks are centered around the head and neck, not really around other joints, like a meaty leg muscle, for example. And so it seems that, again, this theory doesn't seem to explain what happened to these people. Not ruling it out, but it also doesn't fit perfectly either. And so there was one other explanation put forward, and it's the one that the researchers seem to have honed in on a little more, and it's possibly the most sinister thing it could be, because the team believe that potentially this might be the best solid archaeological proof in the whole of England that medieval people genuinely believed and fought the good fight against revenants, walking corpses, ghouls, the undead, bodies that wouldn't stay in the ground. Looks like a well-preserved zombie, acts like a vampire. We do have written evidence that this belief truly was alive and well at exactly this time too. A 12th century monk called William of Newburgh, writing from Newburgh Priory, recorded 4 separate accounts of revenants, and how they were dealt with. The first talked about a man from Buckingham who, the night after his burial, walked back into his house and went straight to bed, which understandably absolutely terrified his grieving widow. He apparently did it again on the second night. Very unwelcome. And so by the third, the wife had made sure that there were people in the house who were able to keep him out. So instead, he changed targets and popped along to his brother's house, but they fought him off too. And by this point, the word had gotten around, so the entire village was taking turns keeping watch throughout the night, because this thing was now wandering around, terrifying the livestock. I can imagine it would be pretty terrifying to see yourself too, surely. But it got worse when he started getting up and shuffling about during the day too. What was interesting though, was that most people couldn't see him, but supposedly they could feel that he was there. Ghost? Zombie? Vampire thing? That is a new one for this channel. Eventually, locals, who I can imagine were rather short on sleep and patience, went to the archdeacon, who took it to the Bishop of Lincoln. He called a council, and the conclusion was a resounding, well, there's nothing else for it then. Dig up the body and burn it. The bishop thought that was a little overkill, pardon the pun, and so he wrote a letter of absolution, had the grave dug up, and placed the letter on the man's chest before sealing it back up. Apparently, this actually worked, and the man was finally able to rest in peace without worrying about getting his 10k steps in every day. The second case that William wrote about happened in Berwick. A corpse started rising from his grave and wandering around the area, followed by packs of dogs. I wonder why. Rotting meat, anyone? The town held a meeting about what to do with him, and they were kind of split into two camps. Some didn't want anything to do with him, as they were scared of being attacked, but others, notably the wealthier, more educated crowd, worried that having a rotting corpse amongst them was going to putrefy the air and cause an outbreak of the plague. So they agreed to dig him up, cut the remains apart and burn it. The detail that got me though was that people who had actually encountered this corpse allegedly said that the guy himself had told them how to deal with him. It was recorded that he said, "You need to burn me to ash." So there you go, instruction manual with the corpse. But the town didn't move fast enough, and by the time they burned the remains, the plague had already started and people in Berwick did start dying. Case number 3 happened in Melrose Abbey, and you may have actually heard of it. It's talked about now as the Hunderprest vampire. It started with a chaplain who was not so committed to the holy life, shall we say. Preferred hunting rather than praying and whatnot. So that's why he was nicknamed Hunderprest, or dog priest. When he died, he was still buried within the monastery though, and that should have been the end of it. Instead, he kept climbing out of his grave at night. He couldn't get to anyone in the monastery itself, but he found another target, a noblewoman he used to serve. And in the most creepy way possible, he would circle her bedroom at night, in the dark. Away with you, don't be doing that. Rightly so, the noblewoman complained, and so a friar, along with a small group of men, went to keep watch at the Hunderprest's grave. After midnight, with no sign of the corpse, most of the group went to a nearby house to warm up, leaving the friar on his own. I think you can guess where this is going to go now. The corpse climbed out of his grave and rushed straight for him. The friar fought it off with an axe, wounded it, and forced it back into the grave. After that, there was no movement. When the rest of the group returned, I can only imagine the words that were spoken between them, but they dug the body up to check, and apparently it was still full of blood coming from the axe wound. Way more, supposedly, than a body that had been dead for this long had any right to have. Well, that settled it then. We've got an undead vampire situation. They hauled the remains outside of the monastery walls, burned it, and scattered the ashes. The last story that William talks about in his chronicles happens in a place called Anantis, which could possibly mean modern-day Alnwick. A man fled to Anantis from Yorkshire, running away from either the law or enemies, we don't know. But he got himself settled there, started a new life serving a local lord, and got married. Things were not happily ever after though, as the guy became convinced that his wife was cheating on him. And so he did the old, pretend to go away on a business trip, but really I'm going to stay at home to catch you in the act. He hid in the beams above the bedroom, and when the wife surely did bring a lover boy back to the marital bed, he went to jump down and confront her. Only in his shock and rage, he misjudged it, fell, and seriously injured himself. Immediately, his wife goes into damage control mode. Loverboy made a run for it, and she just started telling her husband, "Oh, you must have been having a hallucination from falling. Yeah, you didn't see what you think you saw. Definitely not." The guy did not buy it at all, but the man fell sick not too long after that. So when the priest was called to hear his confession and perform the final rites, he was still so angry, seething with his wife's betrayal. So he says, "No, I'm gonna do that another day. Just go away. He unfortunately didn't make it that far though, and passed away not too long afterwards. He was still given a proper Christian burial, but that didn't seem to matter, as soon after he started leaving his grave at night, wandering the area with, again, dogs trailing behind him everywhere. At first, similarly to the case in Berwick, people were worried that the corpse was going to beat them, and so they stayed away. But the cadaver started rotting, so there was something worse to be afraid of, the plague. And rightly so, as people did start succumbing to the disease again. Others fled the area to save themselves. On Palm Sunday, the priest who had seen him just before he died called everyone together. Let's think of a solution, get this thing done and dusted. Only what was supposed to be a super productive undead hunting meeting turned into a feast, and so not a lot of planning was done. Two brothers who'd just lost their own father to the sickness decided if no one else is going to do it, then they needed to do something themselves instead. They dug up the corpse and found that it was all red and swollen. The burial shroud was completely torn apart. When they struck the remains, all manner of not niceness came rushing out. Way more than should have been left in a body by then, and so they concluded this corpse must have been feeding. They dragged the body out of the village to burn it, removing the heart to make sure that it would burn properly, as was the logic at the time. And it's recorded that as soon as the body was reduced to ash, the air instantly purified and no one else got sick. And so those were just 4 cases that were written in this chronicle, but up and down the country, people were actively fighting against these walking dead. There was this panic that was only solidified once they prized open the graves of these revenants and saw the body looking plump and full. Maybe blood around the mouth, burial shrouds torn as the body is swollen. And while nowadays we know what happens when a body decomposes, it fills with gas, so it can look bloated and have plumped skin. Liquids leak out of orifices, including the mouth. If you strike the cadaver, you may find more material inside. I'm sorry, I'm really trying not to gross you out too much if you're eating right now, but that material expels with more force because of aforementioned gas, making it seem like there was more in there than when the corpse died. But way back then, when these bones were dated, between the 11th and 13th century, they had no idea about all of this. And so they were left with the only conclusion that they could come to. These were the living dead, and they needed to be dealt with by striking them, burning them, dismembering them with the same viciousness that was seen in the pit in Wharram Percy, leading researchers to think maybe this is what has happened here. But because nothing is as neat and tidy as that in history, particularly history where you're dealing with ancient undead vampires, revenant corpses were almost exclusively men who had sinned in some way in life. But the problem with the pit in Wharram Percy is that women and children were found, with the same treatment here. But archaeological investigation is still ongoing. They're discovering new things all the time about the site, so maybe at some point we might get new information come to light. One theory proven or another disproven, we don't know. But for now, as of June 2026, that's where the history leaves us. And so the question that I know is right on top of mind right now. Any word on ghosts? Well, at least that was the question for me. Finding a pit of desecrated remains would be enough to cause a ghost in any other place, right? Not to mention the evictions, being forced to move away and your family home destroyed so sheep can have a nibble. And so what I found was really quite surprising, or what I didn't find, as I didn't come across any stories of any ghosts at Wharram Percy, other than a particularly dark legend that I'll tell you about in a second. But I know what you're thinking right now. What do you mean? No one's even witnessed so much as a hooded monk. That's always a shoo-in. I know, I'm in the same boat as you. But to be fair, on the other hand, not really mad about it. The site is now looked after by Historic England. You can visit what's left of the ghost village. You can see where the old farmsteads were, what's left of the church, and the labourer's cottage that was most recently dated from 1845. Although I think the cottage is completely boarded up. You can't get inside that building now. And so one thing I did find was that people who visit say it is very eerie, quite unsettling, and just feels a bit too quiet rather than being nice and peaceful. But whether that's just because of the site itself, we can never really say for sure. I mean, the foundations are there. You can very easily walk around, imagining what it would have been like. This bustling, busy, alive community, filled with hundreds of people working the land every day. And now it's just empty, just shells and covered up foundations left of what for a lot of people was their whole life. And so yeah, you can see it. It's a pretty haunting thought, as well as of course the brutal desiccation of remains stretched over centuries. But I promised you one legend, and it does seem to be a legend. I have no names or no dates, but the story goes that one man was crushed to death under a falling building while he slept, as the village was crumbling around him. Some versions of the story say that he was the last villager who refused to move. Others say that he was a squatter, but we just don't know, as there were labourers living at the village until 1976. Could that make the legend after that time? But there's no news reports. And if it was from the forced evictions from the 16th century, yeah, I think we're out of luck for evidence from that time period. So maybe in time, if more details about the village's history is disturbed in archaeological digs, if something else comes to light, if someone is just in the right place at the right time, they may learn, for themselves at least, that the village is haunted. But even if not, it's no surprise that Wharram Percy regularly tops the lists as the most haunting medieval ghost village. But what a story, honestly. One thing, I actually really enjoyed covering a location that doesn't really claim to be haunted. There have been a few things captured here and there from some paranormal investigators with their devices and people who say that they're sensitive, but overall, as far as we know, no lady in white, no Dick Turpin, no hooded monk. That's the thing that I can't get my head around. And so I know that this one is probably not going to be to everyone's taste this week, but then on the other hand, we got potential undead vampire corpses rising from their graves. So yeah, I'd say that's still pretty morbid, mysterious and macabre. But even aside from that, in the research, going through the old newspaper archives, you could see the village actively dying. In the 19th century, it was advert after advert of entire flocks of sheep being sold off, whole stables of horses, farming implements, even all the wood that they'd chopped up, just selling everything. But what do you think happened to the people of Wharram Percy who were buried in those pits? Was it fear of the undead, or a community trying to survive under an extreme situation when famine hit? Tell me your thoughts, your theories, and if you've ever visited, how did you find it? Was it quite eerie or more peaceful? I want to know all of the things. And if there are any more stories like this, perhaps not all about the ghosts, but a dark moment in our history, possibly a little mystery thrown in there too, let me know your recommendations, what you want to see me cover in a future episode. But if you enjoyed this video, let me know by giving it one of those little likes. And if you haven't already, but you like what I'm doing over here, please do consider subscribing. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go and get a drink of water. I need you to stay hydrated, please. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I had to keep checking my parting in the mirror all through that, as just this morning I realised that my scalp is peeling because I got super sunburned at Download Festival last weekend, even though I put SPF on my scalp. Oh well. Not the only remnant from my time at Download, as you can probably tell by my voice.